Welcome to another special edition of Military Matters. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
And I'm Desmon Farris.
So we're supposed to be working on season 2 of the show. We were really excited to get to tackling other topics aside from COVID-19.
We were talking about UFOs, MARSOC, diets, topics that would be a little lighter and maybe fun going into our second season.
But as you no doubt have seen, that whole plan fell apart. Right now doesn't seem like the right time for a UFO romp. The country seemed to ignite over these last couple of weeks after the death of George Floyd. I've been advised to use the word death instead of murder, as the latter term is reserved for a conviction, and no one's been convicted of anything yet. The death of George Floyd has shaken this country to its core.
We've seen protests, riots, brutality from both civilians and police. And then our military was pulled into the fray when National Guard troops were called up by their states. Then the president ordered active duty troops to the D.C. area to potentially reinforce the D.C. National Guard, police, and Secret Service.
Before we go any further, you should know that we try very hard to take zero sides on this show. I have my own beliefs, and so does Des, but we don't bring that to this podcast. We try to bring you the story of an issue and let you decide what you're going to do with that information. That's not because we were told by Stars and Stripes. It's because we decided early on in the show that we didn't want to be political. It's also in the spirit of Stripes to take no sides.
With that said, this story is riddled with political landmines. I have no doubt that you will interpret this in your own way, and you should. This story is part of a bigger dialogue about justice, about the use of military, and the intersection between civil and military authority. We'll be talking about our troops, about the Insurrection Act, about lawful orders, and about what the Sergeant Major of the Army wants his troops to know during this tumultuous time.
You might be inclined during this episode to believe that we're taking sides in this dialogue. And maybe we are. We're on the side that promotes a peaceful dialogue between all Americans, one that promotes equality, liberty, and justice for all. We believe in the Constitution of the United States above all political parties, official offices, and military ranks or positions. We're on the side of freedom and those that defend it. This is Military Matters.
Well, there are a number of things different happening right now. We're in a very interesting time as, numerous different issues are swirling together. It's not any one thing. We're looking at civil rights protests combined with rioting and looting in response to a unarmed black man who was killed by police officers in Minneapolis, combined with COVID-19. The virus continues to be an issue, and the various states of lockdown continue to exist. And then when you have people responding to longstanding social issues, and one could argue people who have felt marginalized or antagonized by President Trump. So all of these things are combining into one historical moment that we're seeing unfold right now this week.
That's Jack Murphy. He's a former Army Green Beret turned journalist, now working with ConnectingVets.com.
As far as what I cover, the military, what happened back on Saturday was that the 82nd Airborne Division received an alert for the first time. They were alerted, and then the Pentagon initially denied that it was happening. And then once they were actually deployed back on the early morning hours of June 2nd, they changed to no comment and would not comment on the size, strength, and disposition of said active duty forces on the outskirts of Washington, D.C.
Since my conversation with Jack, the active duty troops that were deployed to the D.C. area have been recalled back to Fort Bragg. But there are some reports that some elements are outside the capital region ready to be called up. But who were these troops, and how were they activated for this type of mission?
So the 82nd Airborne, you have to understand, has the IRF, the Immediate Response Force, which is like America's 911 call that the president can hit when you need to rapidly deploy soldiers to crises anywhere around the world. The IRF specifically, there is the IRB. So there in the Immediate Response Force, there are 3 IRBs, IRB 1, 2, and 3. It's an Immediate Response Battalion. So IRB 1 was the element that got deployed from Fort Bragg, North Carolina to Joint Base Andrews, Maryland, right on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. They took C-17 aircraft, flew there. By some reports, the 82nd Airborne soldiers were actually staying in the Air Force One hangar for a while. Meanwhile, helicopters, UH-60 Blackhawks and CH-47 Chinooks were flown in to be their air package. And this would have the 82nd Airborne active duty paratroopers poised to respond to emergencies or any other sort of deployment inside Washington, D.C. within minutes. They could, we're talking about they would, by helicopter, they would be just minutes away from central Washington, D.C.
This contingent of the IRF that was ready to deploy within the Capitol was known as Task Force 504. I was curious if there had been talk of consideration of deploying the IRF to other cities, such as Minneapolis or New York.
Yes, there have been. And this would require, so Washington, D.C. and federal land in Washington, D.C. falls under somewhat different auspices, and there's some more leeway there as far as what the United States government can do. But to deploy, say we were to deploy active duty soldiers to Minneapolis or New York City or a place like that, it would likely involve the White House invoking the 1807 Insurrection Act, which is sort of the loophole to posse comitatus.
We talked about posse comitatus in our Fast Take episode, but basically it's the law that prohibits the use of active duty troops in law enforcement.
So the Insurrection Act can be invoked in times of rebellion or insurrection, or times where violent acts are depriving Americans of their constitutional rights, and state governments cannot or will not intercede in those incidents. So the White House would probably have to rely on the 1807 Insurrection Act to deploy soldiers to cities around the United States if they were to go that route.
If you followed along with the news, you probably saw the security around the White House had been bolstered with fences and guards. Just prior to the deployment of the IRF, the White House perimeter came dangerously close to being overrun.
The first night of the rioting, really, the main gate at the White House was breached. You had a guard tower or a guard shack, overrun, set on fire. They're not Secret Service agents. They're actually part of the security detail, but at the White House, but they belong to the Secret Service. And dozens of them were injured during that fighting. Because of all of that going on, the Secret Service brought President Trump down to a bunker to make sure that he was safe and secure during that incident, just in case protesters or rioters did totally breach the White House defenses and actually breach and get into the White House. So I think you have to understand that, we regard our government as this monolithic institution that's just there and it's been there forever, that actually the artifice of the state is much more fragile than perhaps we think it is. So it's not necessarily a surprise that, the government relies on the United States military to do the heavy lifting when things aren't looking so good for them.
The D.C. National Guard and police forces from neighboring areas were brought in to reinforce the security, while Task Force 504 remained ready to deploy from nearby. When word got around that active duty troops could be called in, like many, Jack was concerned about what this could mean for the troops and for the civilians protesting and rioting.
I think there are definitely concerns, and I would just say that the deployment of active duty paratroopers for riot control is not the right solution here. And I say this, I was a former paratrooper myself in Ranger Battalion. Those guys are not trained for that type of operation, and their mentality is for war. That you have these guys who are wound up, they're ready to fight, and they're really good at what they do. These are hardcore dudes, and they like to fight. And our country is lucky to have soldiers like this, but they are the wrong type of soldier to deploy for this type of incident. You send them in there to do this job, and for them, it's going to get out of hand really quickly. And I don't necessarily even blame them for that. It's just, you do not deploy paratroopers and special forces soldiers for domestic riot control or domestic law enforcement. It's just a recipe for disaster.
Whether it's a good idea or bad idea is up to the decision makers, specifically the president. You see, he's the only one who can make that call. It's an executive power that only he can wield, but like we said in our First Take episode, posse comitatus is the law that even the president cannot break. After the break, we'll talk with an expert in military law to discuss what it means for guard troops of the IRF to have boots on ground and what happened at Lafayette Square. Then later, the Sergeant Major of the Army shares his thoughts on the state of the country and his message to the troops. After the break. This episode of Military Matters is brought to you by Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes provides independent news and information to the U.S. military community, including active duty service members, DoD civilians, veterans, contractors, and their families. Unique among Department of Defense authorized news outlets, Stars and Stripes is governed by the principles of the First Amendment. No slants, no agendas, just the news.
Use promo code podcast and save 50% on your digital subscription.
Go to stripes.com and see the difference for yourself. That's stripes.com.
When your orders come in and it's time to make a plan to move or store your personally owned vehicle, International Auto Logistics is here as the #1 resource for U.S. service members' POV needs. Just use their website to get started at www.pcsmypov.com to get all of the information you'll need on storing and picking up your vehicle. Or check out the just launched IAL mobile app. Just search for PCS My POV in the Apple Store or on Google Play. During a call with governors, law enforcement, and national security officials, President Trump suggested the use of the National Guard in order to dominate protesters. They had to get tough or they would look like, quote, a bunch of jerks. With Task Force 504 waiting for the call minutes away from the Capitol, could elements of the IRF have been called into other cities? Could troops be deployed into those cities even if the governors didn't request them?
Most of the times it's been done in the past, it's been done at the request of a governor and not over the head of a governor. Although there are exceptions to that, such as the desegregation of schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, back in the 1950s. But it's an extremely serious step, especially if it's taken over the heads of the governor, or in the case of Washington, D.C., the mayor. And I think it would be inadvisable at this time.
That's attorney Kevin Carroll.
My name's Kevin Carroll. I'm a litigation partner at the law firm of Wiggin and Dana. My last government job was serving as a senior counselor to Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly. And I'm a veteran. I'm not here speaking on behalf of the military today, but I am a veteran.
So what is the litmus test to determine whether a state should have active duty troops deployed to it?
What the courts have usually looked to is whether or not the federal courts are still in operation and whether or not federal court orders are being enforced. So for the example of Eisenhower sending troops to Little Rock back in the 1950s, that was because a federal court order to desegregate the schools wasn't being enforced. The mayor, the governor, the adjutant general of the state National Guard said they wouldn't help. And U.S. Marshals were an insufficient force to get it done. So they had to send in the 101st. The way it's usually done would be an example from 1992 during the LA riots. You had, I believe, almost 65 citizens killed in the city over a period of just a few days. And the governor of California at the time, Pete Wilson, and President Bush 41 agreed, this is serious enough, we need to send in some federal forces. Something that's not well known, they sent the 7th Infantry down from Fort Ord, and they sent some 1st Marine Division unit up from Camp Pendleton. And the person leading the Marine Battalion was future Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly.
Antifa, or anti-fascist, has been blamed by Attorney General William Barr and President Trump for a lot of the rioting and has been accused of organizing violence against police officers and destroying the communities around protests. The president recently tweeted that Antifa would be labeled a terrorist organization. Normally, terror organizations are outside actors from another country, but this one would be a domestic terror organization.
There is no provision to designate groups in the United States as domestic terrorist organizations. The FBI has lots of domestic terrorism cases against white extremists, against black extremists, against environmental extremists, animal rights extremists, anti-abortion extremists. And to the Bureau's credit, they really are very punctilious about not interfering with First Amendment speech. And when people talk about designating domestic terrorist some domestic organization as a terrorist organization, I think they're on very, very dangerous ground or very slippery slope.
So when we start labeling domestic organizations as terrorists, we open a door to politicizing any organization. Let's say it's a Democratic administration. They could theoretically brand the NRA or any opposing organization as terrorists. The same could be done for political opponents. That's the slippery slope that Kevin's talking about. This will no doubt be argued by lawyers on several sides before a decision is made as to what gets labeled what.
One of the questions we received numerous times was, what was the difference between active duty troops being deployed within the U.S. and martial law? Aren't they the same thing?
Great question. So one thing that I think the administration hasn't really thought through is that if federal troops are asked to keep order on the streets, the Fourth Amendment still applies to them. So the Fourth Amendment protects American citizens against unreasonable seizures. And the Supreme Court has found in Tennessee versus Garner and other cases that an act of force is a seizure in a sense, which makes sense. I put my hands on you, grab you, put you in custody. The military still has to follow the rules of the police. It's not like they have an extra card where they can use more force than somebody else. And this was brought into stark relief back in the 90s. The Clinton administration had a bad idea to deploy Marines on the southwest border under Joint Task Force 6 to look at drug trafficking organizations. And a Marine sniper shot a shepherd boy, a little teenager with a .22 rifle, and killed him. And the Marine was prosecuted by the local district attorney under Texas state law. So it's not as if there's some pass that the military gets if they do this. As far as martial law would be in the cases where the federal courts can no longer operate. So you'd have to go back to the Civil War, and even then it was very narrow distinctions. If you had the Union Army operating in Mississippi, during the siege of Vicksburg, they could carry out martial law because you had a full-on insurrection. The United States courts were not in operation, and if the U.S. Army found you committing a crime, you could bring a civilian before a military tribunal. That was not allowed in the border states, for example. And the key case is Ex parte Milligan, which involved a Confederate sympathizer in, I believe it was Baltimore, who was tried by a military tribunal. And the Supreme Court found that was not lawful. The federal courts were in operation in Baltimore, even though, there was, obviously the Confederate invasion of Maryland in 1862 and so forth that ended in Antietam. So it would be an absolutely extraordinary case in which martial law had to be imposed in the United States that we haven't seen since 1865.
During my interview with Kevin, I was interested in knowing more about a soldier's right to question a potentially unlawful order. How would a soldier go about questioning an order to, for example, shoot into a crowd?
You have a responsibility not to follow illegal orders, an affirmative responsibility. And I'll give you an example. I believe the order to clear Lafayette Park of peaceful protesters who were not in violation of curfew to facilitate a photo op by the President of the United States was an illegal order and should not have been carried out. President Trump has twice given an illegal order, including in recent days, stating treat people who are throwing rocks as if they had rifles.
Kevin is referring to an immigration speech in 2018 in which the president stated that the military would treat thrown rocks from Mexican citizens at the border as weapons. When they throw rocks, like they did at Mexico military and police, I say consider it a rifle.
It would be a unconstitutional, unreasonable, unlawful use of force that could get somebody thrown in state or federal prison. So illegal orders are given. President Trump, I think, has given them recently. And service members should be aggressive about pushing back and seeking legal counsel and speaking to their inspectors general and elected representatives about it.
I'm not a lawyer, but Kevin Carroll is. This is his professional opinion and not one that reflects anyone else. This is a serious assessment of the situation, a situation that I and Mr. Carroll were not at. I'm a huge believer in that nothing is ever so cut and dry, black and white. What happened at Lafayette Park is no doubt being investigated, as it has become a very controversial event. But I was curious what happens if a soldier carries out an unlawful order unwittingly, that is, he or she doesn't realize it's illegal, but it later comes to light that it was. Are they legally responsible if they were following orders?
I believe they are. Under a 1971 case, Bivens versus 6 unidentified federal narcotics officers, I would think that good counsel and good lawyers would encourage any legal action to be taken against Secretary Esper, rather than some E3. But yeah, they're at a legal risk, and they shouldn't have obeyed that illegal order. And you're taking a risk of criminal prosecution or a civil judgment that you're going to have to pay yourself if you obey an illegal order that isn't even colorably legal. And I think saying we got to gas and club the protesters because the president wants to do a photo op, everybody should have known wasn't legal on his face.
I remember being told over and over and over again that I could question any order if I think it's illegal. And thankfully, I was never put in a position that I've ever considered an order questionable. And I want to believe that I would have the courage to speak up and say something if I had. But for those DC Guard members and the police at Lafayette Square who had boots on the ground, well, I'd want to hear their side of it, to know what really happened. And also, it's not like an E5 or E7 gave you an order from the commander. The whole thing was high-level folks getting orders from the commander-in-chief. So you're going to tell the President of the United States, no? That's tough. When we come back from the break, we talk with the 16th Sergeant Major of the Army, Michael Grinston, about the nation, the Army, and his message of unity when we return. This episode of Military Matters is brought to you by Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes provides independent news and information to the U.S. military community, including active duty service members, DoD civilians, veterans, contractors, and their families. Unique among Department of Defense authorized news outlets, Stars and Stripes is governed by the principles of the First Amendment. No slants, no agendas, just the news. Go to stripes.com and see the difference for yourself. That's stripes.com. Use promo code podcast. Get 50% off your digital subscription. Use promo code podcast. Get 50% off your digital subscription. Go to stripes.com now.
Well, I think I have two inspirations.
Sergeant Major of the Army, Michael Grinston.
Our number one is, for the soldiers, active guard and reserve, we want to protect the people of the United States. We really don't want to police the people of the United States. Specifically for the active duty, that's we don't normally do a lot of training on those types of events. So that's what's running through my mind at that moment. We want to protect the people of the U.S., not police them. But I'm also a father. I'm a husband. I'm a son. So the other things that were running through my mind were that could be my son or daughter on the other side of that line, and they just want to have their voices heard. So when I think about, I guess, both perspectives, and I can empathize with both perspectives, the people want to be heard, and we need to protect them so they can have their rights to be heard.
Sergeant Major Grinston has been vocal about his feelings and perspectives towards the state of our country and the Army's potential mission against protesters and rioters. He's spoken out not only as a service member, but also as a biracial person who, by his own accounts, has struggled with racial identity growing up half black and half white in Alabama.
Sergeant Major Grinston is one of many military leaders who have come forward to support the military and to share their opinions and perspectives. Recently, former Secretary of Defense and retired Marine General James Mattis, in an interview with The Atlantic, shared a harsh rebuke of the president's handling of the country's rising racial tensions and the use of the military within the U.S. Since that interview, other notable retired military members have come forward publicly disagreeing with the president. I asked Sergeant Major Grinston if he was concerned at all that service members might perceive these open disagreements with the country's leadership as an open door to publicly criticize their own leaders, the Army, or the military.
I would just use, the DoD guidelines on how to be vocal. You just kind of follow the general rules. I'm okay with those, voicing their frustrations. And, in the message, I said to soldiers and leaders that we need to listen. And maybe some people, if they don't exactly get, the right way to voice, that individual's frustrated and he or she wants to say something. They want to reach out, and it's emotional and it's passionate. And I understand. I get the same emotion and passion right now. So follow the guidelines, but if you want to speak out, speak out.
Earlier in the show, we talked with attorney Kevin Carroll about lawful orders and what that meant for service members. Sergeant Major Grinston wants troops to remember that there are numerous avenues to exercise your right and duty to question a potentially unlawful order.
Well, I'm a soldier, and if we have lawful orders, we have to follow lawful orders. It's just that there's a way, if you're concerned with something the chain of command does, that you can voice a complaint. We have open door policies. You have other things. I can't speak for people that are out of the military and all these other things. I can just speak for, as a soldier perspective. It goes back to what I was saying. If you need to listen, and there's a way to do that. Every unit has an open door policy, and we have other people that we can talk to. There's all kinds of mediums that if you have a concern, that you can voice those concerns with what you have. But bottom line, all the other things, I try to stay out of the politics.
Politics and media have been central players in the nation's civil unrest. I wanted to know if there was anything that the media was getting wrong. There was something that Sergeant Major Grinston wanted to get the record straight on.
I think what's portrayed isn't always what is shown on the media, is how we are safeguarding the American people as best we can, given the task that we've been asked to do. So there's not one specific thing, is that I just wish we would tell both sides of the story from the military perspective. But, the nation right now is struggling with this complex issue, and the Army is struggling with a complex issue. So I think it's going to take some time. I don't see gross negligence and misrepresentation from the media. It's a difficult topic, and the active guard and reserves are in a difficult situation on each side.
These difficult times have presented leaders with unique challenges. Part of that challenge has been having to discuss complex and volatile subjects like race, equality, and what it means to be an American.
Anytime that we can, talk about the Army, this is a difficult time, but, that's why, that's kind of why we have some leaders in the Army that we need to, sometimes we have to talk about those difficult things. You just can't shy away from it. And I think that's part of the message, is taking the time to talk about it. Don't internalize it. Talk about it, and then listen, and then when necessary, take a little action. And I think that's important.
This has been a difficult year for the United States of America. We opened the year coming close to a war with Iran. COVID-19 has killed thousands worldwide and sickened millions more. Our economy is in shambles due to protective measures to stop the spread of the disease. And now many of our nation's cities lay in ruins. Businesses already suffering from COVID-19 are destroyed. Thousands are injured. Every day we seem to hear about more deaths related to the violence.
And on social media, we are flooded by the politics, police brutality, violent looters, protests, a call to arms, a call to take sides, and all around us feels like the nation and world are spinning out of control.
But we also have to see the other side of this. Our nation did not go to war. We all came together, some reluctantly, but we all did what we could to slow the spread of a disease and avoiding the worst estimates of deaths by a lot. We've endured a lot and have made great strides. And all over social media, there are messages of hope. There are messages of unity from men and women who served this country to preserve the freedom to peacefully assemble. Police officers are making a stand against those in their own ranks who would compromise the safety of their fellow officers and citizens. It's happening, and it's powerful, and it gives us hope. But we're not out of the woods yet, folks. Not by a long shot. There are dark days ahead of us, for sure. New challenges. But I have no doubt that we're up to it. I have no doubt in the men and women of the United States military to preserve what we all hold dear. Our freedom.
This was a Military Matters special edition. We're going to get back to making season 2, and hopefully the next you hear from us, we'll have some brighter news to share. Maybe we'll do a story on murder hornets. We could see how many stings Rod can handle till he passes out. And no, it's not a murder hornets challenge.
Folks, be sure to follow us on Twitter at StripesMMPod. You can also email us at podcast@stripes.com. That's podcast singular at stripes.com. You can also find Desmon on Twitter at dpodfarris. Also, did you know you can use your smart device to hear Stars and Stripes? Just tell Alexa to open Stars and Stripes and boom, no spin news right there just for you. This episode was written and produced by Rod Rodriguez, additional production assistance by Desmon Farris, executive produced by Benjamin Bateman. This was a Stars and Stripes production. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
And I'm Desmon Farris.
We'll see you in season 2.